My name is Steve Garguilo, and I'm proud to be opening today on behalf of our entire team here at Cultivate. And way back when, I got to study some degree that sounds kind of made up called Humanitarian Engineering and Social Entrepreneurship, which is basically like design for global challenges. How do we really design solutions for problems, big problems facing the world? Which was really cool. And I got to spend time in different parts of the world. And right after school, I was actually in Kenya working on some telemedicine initiatives. And that set me up to go work for one of the biggest companies in the world, Johnson & Johnson. And so I go into this 140,000 person company with all kinds of energy and ideas around, oh, we're going to change the world, the opportunity to make change at scale and make a positive impact. And I started to get really obsessed with how do people actually make ideas happen here? Who are the people who can be really successful to challenge the status quo and advance new thinking when sometimes there can be systems and bureaucracy and the kinds of things that prohibit that or make that difficult? And so I started collecting people who were capable of doing that and who had done that and trying to learn from them. And like, what are the things that you do to successfully advance ideas? And actually started building a community of those people. I wouldn't have used that language at the time, but really that's what it was bringing those people together so that we could learn from each other, support each other, and make positive change happen inside the company. And so about 2 years into doing that, just like on the side of my desk as like a fun thing to do because I really enjoyed it, I got a call from the head of HR at J&J. And usually that's not a call that you want to get, a call from the head of HR, but he was kind of like, hey, who are you? What is this? What are you doing? And he flew me from, I was living in Zug, Switzerland at the time. He flew me to New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I got to go into this fancy tower, where like one person has an office on every floor, right? It's like so fancy. And I sat in this meeting, and about 20 minutes into the meeting, he offered me a job. And he said, hey, I think we can really build on the back of this amazing community that has been instigated here. I think it's a great complement to our innovation agenda to think about how do we empower employees to advance ideas? How do we really support new thinking happening inside the company? And so then for 4 years, that was my job. And I had the best job in the world. I got to support people come into my office talking about ideas, build out development experiences, work with the C-suite on finding ways to have junior talent, diverse, underrepresented talent, as ideas really shared at those levels. And it just became so clear to me that work had to be bigger than one company. And so as much as I love that company, I decided I got to start a new one. I got to create the new best job in the world to focus on cultivators, to focus on how do we support more people across industries, across organizations to effectively advance change and advance ideas inside their organizations. And so now about 4 years ago, started Cultivate and really started two things at the same time. Yes, started this company Cultivate that focuses on how do we empower cultivators and support people to make change, but also started the Cultivators community, which is the space if you're a cultivator. Not for, oh, you got to be in marketing or you got to be in IT or you got to be in HR. It's not a functional community, but a how you show up community. If you show up wanting to make change, if you show up wanting to make your organization better, then the Cultivators community is for you. And the kinds of things that people do in the Cultivators community make me so proud to be associated with it every day. We have members like Bethany Goldson from this company called Snapstream. And what she was doing, this is probably like a year and a half ago, I just remember it because it was such a fun day. She was like, hey, I'm rolling out training in my company around goal setting. And I want to make sure that it doesn't feel like training and that it's like legitimately good and engaging. Does anybody in the community want to help me out and be part of a test session with me? And so like 30 people raise their hands of like, oh yeah, sure. And so she runs this test session where she's talking about goal setting, using corgis. It was very fun. And then she got a lot of meaningful feedback on the session and really made it happen and brought it to life. Or someone like Deb Madeline at Mars, the consumer foods company, who was like, hey, I want to bring people together inside my company. I consider myself kind of the chief community officer in my company, and borrowed some tools and recommendations from folks in the cultivators community. But I so love that every day there's a space for cultivators. Every day there's a space and a way for people to connect across companies, across industries, to make the work of cultivating better and make the work of cultivating happen at scale. And we hope that each of you are in a position to start movements inside your organization that do advance positive change. In a moment, I'm going to be welcoming two of our amazing team members here at Cultivate. One is our head of research, who's going to talk a little bit about what we know to be true about cultivators, why companies need cultivators, and how you can use some of this original research we've done over the past couple of years to help you in your journey. When you're trying to convince management, when you're trying to kind of make things happen, what might be some of those data points that help you think about doing that really effectively. And then we're going to hear from our faculty chair as well, who's been answering really big questions about how do we create the context for cultivators to thrive? How do we allow for empowering organizations? And so maybe one last note on this with this word cultivators, because for a period it was like, oh, these are change makers, right? Or a lot of people use the word intrapreneurs, right? Intrapreneurs. I had used the word culture carriers. And I think it was like toying around with these terms when I decided to start this company and collect these cultivator stories and start to see, how do we amplify these kinds of things. And the word cultivators just like stuck. And it was immediately like, this is the right thing, because you're cultivating ideas, you're supporting others around you, and you're working to kind of, till the soil of the organization, so to speak, to make it better. I think in the world we live in 2023, it can be very cool to be an entrepreneur. Of course, it's cool to be an entrepreneur, and you can have a very successful and amazing career, an amazing impact doing something like that. It's also cool to work at a big company. One of the examples that I like to use, kind of a made up example, but this idea that like you could start an organization called Swirly Bulbs, and your whole mission in life could be to get people to change their light bulbs to compact fluorescent swirly bulbs. And you could have an entire career doing that, and you could be saving the planet, right? And that's very legitimate and very good. It's also true that you could move to Bentonville, get a job at Walmart's headquarters, Bentonville, Arkansas, and convince them to change all of their light bulbs in all of their stores and potentially have a bigger impact in a shorter period of time. And so big companies, yes, can be kind of at the root of some of the biggest challenges in the world, but they can also be sources of amazing impact and positivity when cultivators inside those organizations push for that change. And when cultivators inside those organizations advance that change, advance new thinking, and empower others to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to our head of research to talk a little bit about cultivators, what we know to be true, and our research agenda here at Cultivate, Kris Bell.
Thanks, Steve. Let's talk about some research. You just heard Steve share a couple examples of cultivators in action, and now I'm going to dive a little deeper into the research that explains why companies need cultivators like you. But first, you're going to be hearing the word cultivator a lot today, and we've already said it multiple times, so let's make sure we're clear about what that word actually means. Here's a definition for you. A cultivator is an employee who creates positive change within their organization. It's a fairly simple definition, but it's actually grounded in a surprisingly large body of research we've conducted over the past few years. I'm going to touch on all of the parts of this definition over the next few minutes, starting with the last one, the organization. While our research has shown us that cultivators can be found in nearly every organization, much of our work focuses on folks in large organizations, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is that more of us work for large companies now than ever before. And to us, that means more of us are facing the barriers and problems that are unique to large organizations, and more of us have opportunities to leverage the power of those large organizations to make an outsized impact. Because big companies do have outsized impact on large numbers of individuals, entire industries, and society more broadly. And we see this all the time, both negative examples and positive ones. Our own research and experiences with cultivators have shown us stories of people working in large organizations who try to address an inequality or change something for the benefit of the colleagues who are closest to them, and end up inspiring changes that ripple outward from one department to an entire company to all of that company's partners and competitors and so on. And those changes, whether they are implementing more equitable parental leave policies that become the gold standard for an entire industry, or creating a workplace community that transforms the way a multinational company engages its employees online, or creating tools that can help writers and creators address those implicit biases that impact their movie scripts, right? They all serve as examples of the magic that can happen when cultivators take action and when they can find each other inside of these large, complex, often difficult contexts so that they can join forces and implement these kinds of really impactful changes. So because we know what happens inside big companies can have such a major impact, and because the work that cultivators do inside those companies is so important, we ask a lot of questions around here about exactly how and why those relationships between cultivators and their organizations play out. We generated more questions about this than we could possibly answer in a lifetime of rigorous research. Here are just a few that represent areas we've been focusing on in some of our recent work. Questions like, what types of actions do we commonly see across diverse, unique cultivator stories? That's one of the central questions we found some answers to through projects like our cultivator story analysis last year. In this study, we started building the first ever collection of cultivator stories, which are published stories about cultivators attempting to create change inside their organization. These might be articles, blog posts, narratives written about company award winners, etc. And that includes the stories of many of the cultivators you'll be hearing from throughout today's conference, and that you can read about on our website. So we collected over 40 of those stories as an initial data set, reviewed them, and created criteria that allowed us to focus on a subset of those stories for deeper analysis. Out of those 18 stories that we analyzed in more depth, we found over 50 unique actions that the cultivators took as they drove a particular change in their organization. And through our analytical process, we organized those actions into 8 high-level themes that represent some of the most common types of actions that appeared across many of the stories. We also created journey maps based on the data from our analysis. This is a way of visualizing, in a simplified form, the order in which those 8 common themes we discovered tend to appear in the stories. Of course, every cultivator story doesn't follow this exact pathway, and as cultivators yourselves, you'll recognize that the reality of these journeys is often much more complex, full of detours and iterative cycles and gaps, and not every attempt at change is successful. However, the data tells us that many of the steps in this journey, when they occur, are likely to be crucial for the vast majority of cultivators. And so I'll highlight a couple of those for you. We found, for example, that 83% of the stories included cultivators recruiting allies and collaborators to their cause. And 94% included something we call building a civic reputation, which includes the many actions that cultivators take to live into their values, lead by example, et cetera, as they attempt to create change. So while we've gained some important insights about how many cultivators take action to create positive change, we also know that cultivators as individuals aren't the only important variables when it comes to making a positive impact, because we all do the work we do inside the larger organizational context that we're in, and that context really matters. So our research on cultivators emphasizes their individual and collective actions as people without much, if any, formal power or authority in their organizations and what they can do to be successful, even in unsupportive contexts. But we also focus a lot on empowerment within those contexts and what organizations can do to better support and empower their employees to drive positive change from every level. So another set of insights I'd like to share with you is about the organizational context where cultivators like you work and how we've come to think about empowerment and disempowerment in those contexts. So one of the reasons we focus so much on empowerment is that we know workplaces are experiencing a serious empowerment deficit. One study found that only 36% of professionals felt empowered to do their best work. And that's a shame because other researchers have tied the experience of empowerment to so many crucial business and individual outcomes, from innovation to retention and more. And we know from larger scale studies and findings like those discussed in Gartner's annual Future of Work report that approaches to mitigating these challenges that may have worked to an extent back in 2019 and earlier aren't necessarily working anymore. And organizations are going to need new tools, new ways of framing and addressing these problems if they and their employees are going to thrive moving forward. So for us, the best possible strategy an organization could adopt moving forward is one that centers cultivators and prioritizes empowerment. And we know empowerment can serve as the key to addressing so many common organizational problems and opportunities because the way we define empowerment goes way beyond the concept of autonomy. It's not just about managers delegating power or changing decision-making workflows. Empowerment is a multidimensional model that we've constructed through an extensive literature review and collaboration with partners like Penn State University's Farrell Center for Corporate Innovation and Entrepreneurship and others. And what we found through our research and our collaborations around organizational empowerment is that empowerment is complex, but we've worked to reduce that complexity into a usable model to explain the key dimensions of empowerment to cultivators and to organizational leaders who want to empower themselves, each other, and to create more empowering cultures and spaces where everyone can thrive. So the 5 dimensions of our SPACE model of organizational empowerment represents 5 needs that must be met in order for employees to feel fully empowered at work. The first dimension is skill. This represents the need to feel a sense of mastery and confidence in our work. You meet this need through learning and development programs, but also through things like clarity around job roles and expectations. The next is purpose, and there's a lot of content out there right now about the importance of organizations doubling down on their purpose, helping employees find meaning in their work, especially amidst all of the added stressors of pandemic life. And this dimension represents our need to feel connected to the mission of our organization and to feel recognized and appreciated for our contributions. Autonomy is next up. And even though I said just a few moments ago that empowerment is more than just autonomy, that need for autonomy over our work, for some agency, for flexibility, and for a seat at the table when it comes to decision making are still crucial elements of organizational empowerment. They're just not the only element, as you can see. The next one is community, which is our need to feel connected and significant to each other and have a sense of belonging at work. This is a fairly obvious need to us. We've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about community, but it's also the least common element to include in definitions or models of empowerment from others, which is unfortunate because it's so important. And we know that companies that invest in this particular dimension can measurably improve employees' feelings of empowerment. One study showed that employees who felt a sense of belonging at work were about 5 times more likely to feel empowered. There's a large body of work on this subject that bears that out. The final dimension is engagement, which represents our need to feel intrinsically motivated to participate fully in the work that we do. There's a huge body of research out there on the importance of engagement and the perilously low levels of engagement that are pervasive in many of our organizations today. But it's also important to look at that dimension within the larger context of empowerment versus all by itself, because focusing on engagement for engagement's sake is a good way to sell analytics platforms, but engagement for the sake of empowerment is about positioning every employee to have what they need to show up and feel excited to do their best possible work. So through this multidimensional model of empowerment, we've learned that organizations aren't just existing on a binary of empowering or disempowering. Empowerment across these dimensions is dynamic. It can exist in pockets. Some needs might be being met in an organization while others aren't even on the radar. We also have plenty of evidence that organizations can become more empowering and that everyone has a role to play in making that happen. We know that having the tools and frameworks to understand what's working and where there are gaps is one part of that process, but we couldn't find any existing instruments or frameworks that already focused on empowerment in this way. So a couple of years ago, we set out on a journey to make one. And our next speaker was our chief explorer in that process, Dr. Maureen Gillespie, experimental psychologist, assessment expert, and our chair of faculty at Cultivate, is going to share more about our organizational empowerment assessment and how it can help organizations better support their cultivators from the bottom up, middle out, and top down. Please welcome to Maureen.
Thanks, Kris. Organizations measure things like engagement all the time, but not empowerment as often. So we developed a way to help organizations specifically measure empowerment here at Cultivate. It's tricky to measure something that's multifaceted, like empowerment. But as an experimental psychologist, it's my job to figure out how to measure constructs that are not particularly obvious. And over the course of the last 2 years, we developed and validated a new assessment that can be used in large organizations. The assessment is based on our SPACE model of empowerment that you just heard about from Kris, and focuses on questions about empowerment maturity indicators within the organization. Empowering and disempowering traits exist simultaneously in an organization. And this assessment allows users and leadership to measure their employees' attitudes and perceptions to determine the empowering and disempowering traits within the organization. For example, in our assessment, half the items were written where high agreement indicated empowering traits. So something like, if I started a project to change something about my organization, my colleagues would support and help me. Strong agreement here means high empowerment. Half the items were written where high agreement indicated disempowering traits. So for example, an item reads, people at my organization form cliques based on their job rank or function. And here a high agreement would indicate disempowering traits within that organization. So we had over 400 people across a variety of organizations take our 38-item assessment and reflect on their experiences within their large organizations that they worked for. We calculated an empowerment and disempowerment score for each individual and then calculated a ratio. The empowerment score was used as the numerator, and the disempowerment score was used as the denominator. And ideally, you'd like to see high empowerment scores and low disempowerment scores, because that would increase that empowerment ratio. It'd be larger. And larger ratios indicate that empowerment is winning out over disempowerment within that organization. So in our sample of over 400, the average empowerment ratio was just over 1.28, with the top 20% of organizations having empowerment ratios of about 2 or better. That means that the empowering traits were rated twice as highly as the disempowering traits. We also asked our participants a variety of demographic questions. So using the empowerment assessment, individual pockets of highly empowered or disempowered employees can be identified. So in our sample, longtime employees of 15 plus years who had been working for the same organization, who never rose to leadership, showed the lowest empowerment ratios of every other group that we actually assessed. Now, this probably isn't surprising, but it's important to realize that you can find these disempowered pockets within the organization. Imagine looking at your own organization or department. Maybe you'd like to assess empowerment based on gender identity. Or maybe you're concerned about the empowerment levels of those who attend work in different ways. Maybe virtual employees or hybrid employees. Are they different than your in-person employees? Maybe you have questions about race or ethnicity or caregiver status. Any combinations that are useful or interesting to you could be assessed in your organization in this way. And that's what's great about this assessment. It also provides actionable results and recommendations based on your employee perceptions. So here's a look at a sample of real results from an organization of 80 plus people that had innovation goals for the year. Some of the most empowering traits that deserved celebration and recognition within this organization were the employee's sense of purpose and engagement, 2 of our main pillars of the SPACE model. Employees in this organization indicated strong personal connections to the mission and cared about the fate of their company, and they found their work was meaningful and full of purpose. But where the organization had some room to grow was in the sense of community. Many of the disempowering perceptions in that organization were related to community and cross-functional work. With these results, leadership was actually able to see that there were areas for improvement that concerned cross-functional collaboration within the organization and multi-level connections. They had direction about how to remove the barriers for empowerment for their employees, so those employees could innovate and challenge the status quo. And we practice what we preach here at Cultivate. We actually use this assessment ourselves to understand how we work together as a team and where we can continue to grow and learn so we can support cultivators like you.